Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome, Joy. Welcome all the people I haven't yet welcomed. We're going to go through a journey of this Shabbat's reading from the Torah. It's Parshat Emor. It talks mainly about the laws that relate to the priests and the specific details of laws that apply to them. There are a number of areas of education, relating to education, which we want to explore, and that will be part of what we're going to go through the journey tonight. The first thing, as we always do, going through a summary of this Shabbat's reading, it speaks about the laws relating to Kohanim, including the fact that a Kohen, which is part of the Jewish people that are descendants from the tribe of Levi, but specifically children of Aaron, who was the priest then at the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, of Moses. So his descendants are Kohanim, and there are laws that relate to them. For example, they're not allowed to marry a divorcee. They may not come into contact with a human corpse. And as we will soon see as well, aside from immediate family. So practically, if a Kohen loses an immediate member of the family, God forbid, which means a parent, children, siblings, spouse, he may go to the funeral and he may be involved in all of the details relating to bringing that corpse to interment, to burial. But for anybody beyond that immediate circle of closest relatives, he may not. He may also not marry a divorcee. Now, any Jew is allowed to marry a divorcee, a Kohen is not. Then you have one grade up than that, which is the Kohen Gadol. That was one individual who served as the high priest in the temple, specifically busy every day, but particularly on Yom Kippur, we read about all of the duties that he performed. The Kohen Gadol has even more details that relates to whom he can marry. Not only may he not marry a divorcee, he may not marry a widow either. So he can only marry somebody who's never been married before. And he cannot even come into contact with any human corpse other than a meit mitzvah, which we're going to describe. One situation where he can. Generally, we know that purity and keeping pure to go into the temple relates to life, and anything that relates to death is termed to be tameh or impure. It's not a judgment of negativity, it's just the status of being. Judaism relates to life, and when there is death, it creates a status that has to be undone by a process, going to the mikveh, etc. So there's a whole method and process of retaining and regaining purity. But the Kohen may not come into contact with the dead. For a regular Kohen, he may for his immediate family. For the high priest, not at all. Only one situation where he may come into contact with the dead, and we'll come back to that point. Then it speaks about physical deformities and ritual impurity which preclude a Kohen from service. Quite a difficult thing to understand. We know that physical deformities are never seen as an undermining of a person. Most of our leaders had physical deformities. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu had a speech impediment. Isaac was blind. Jacob limped, had a problem with his thigh after the battle with the angel of Esau. So we don't judge anyone for deformities, but anything in the temple had to be done with a perfect service. Everything had to be perfectly in place. The animal had to be assessed and examined so that it was perfect, and the person had to physically be perfect as well. There are Kabbalistic reasons that are referred to as well. Again, it's not a judgment against the person who is any less, but in order to serve in the temple, they had to be in a state of absolute perfection. Then speaks about teruma. Teruma is one of the tithes, one of the gifts of tzedakah that a regular farmer would give to the priest. The priest did not farm. He did not have any area of land that was attributed to his tribe. The tribe of Levi did not receive any partition of the promised land, and they lived on the gifts that were given to them by the rest of the Jewish people. One of those gifts is teruma. It was either 40th or 50th or 60th, depending on how generous the person wanted to be. and it was given to the Kohen. When it was given to the Kohen, it could only be eaten by a Kohen. The food became hallowed, became holy, and it could only be eaten by the Kohen or his immediate household, which was an extension of him. So his immediate family could. Then we speak about animals with physical deficiencies are precluded from sacrifice. An animal for a sacrifice has to be a minimum of 8 days old. You may never sacrifice an animal and its offspring in the same day. There are a number of verses about this in the Torah, that you cannot sacrifice or slaughter an animal and its offspring in the same day. Continuing and ending the summary, it then speaks about the laws of Kiddush Hashem, which is the requirement to give one's life rather than transgressing certain cardinal sins. So the Talmud tells us very clearly that when it comes to almost all the commandments of the Torah, human life comes first. So if ever one is caught between having to fulfill or do a duty, a religious duty, and God forbid, a life-threatening situation, the duty becomes secondary to life. For example, on Shabbat, we do not use our vehicles, and we do not use anything that relates to driving. So 3 of my children happened to be born on Shabbat. When my wife went into labor, we jumped into the car and we drove, because human life takes precedence over all the commandments. If a person has to eat pork, for example, in order to survive, that is the medicine that is required, we would eat. If a person has to eat it on Yom Kippur, when we're not allowed to eat anything, if it's a matter of saving a life, we do. What are the 3 cardinal sins which transcend life itself, for which we are told that we have to give our lives rather than break those laws? So those 3 laws are idolatry, adultery, and murder. So if a person came to somebody and said, either kill that individual or you will be killed, God forbid, a person has to say, I will not kill, even if I lose my life. Where one's blood is never redder than the next individual's. So those 3 commandments, murder, if a person said, bow down to this idol, in other words, replace your God by bowing down to this idol, the person has to be ready to give their life. If a person says, commit an act of immorality, for example, adultery, or else we will take your life, he has to rather give his life. It's only those 3. In all other situations, although the Rambam extends certain situations or predicaments where it might be extended somewhat, if somebody is specifically trying to undermine the Jewish faith, then there are additional laws that relate to being ready to lay one's life for one's religion. But generally speaking, even the most important commandments of our lives, like keeping Shabbat, like keeping kosher, all of the commandments that we have, they defer to preserving life, except for the 3. Then the subject changes and talks about the festivals of the Jewish year. It speaks about the Shabbat, which is the end of a week, the 7th day of the week, and it has to be holy and has to be proclaimed holy and kept as a day of holiness. But then there is the cycle of the year, which includes Pesach, which remembers the Exodus from Egypt, the counting of the omer, which we are presently doing the 49 days from the festival of Pesach to the festival of Shavuot. And then we have Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the year, Yom Kippur, the major fast day of repentance. There's Sukkot. We remember that God protected us under the cover of his cloud in the desert. And then we have Shmini Atzeret, which is the last day of Sukkot. These festivals, as we will soon see, parallel events that are very physical and relates to the physical cycle of the year. So we're going to see an interesting correlation between a religious, spiritual cycle in the year and how it correlates with the physical condition of the world. Then it speaks about harvesting, and when we harvest the field, we have to leave certain gifts to the poor. There are a number of them. For example, the corner of one's field has to be left for the poor. If one dropped gleanings, it remains for the poor. If one left the sheaf of wheat in the field when one was harvesting and taking it into one's storehouse, we should leave it for the poor. So we are told that there is a requirement in every situation where we accumulate wealth. There has to be a moral commitment to those who are in need, to the poor, to the Kohanim, to those who depend on us. Then speaks about the lighting of the menorah. In order to light the candelabra in the temple, one had to use pure olive oil. It then speaks about the lechem hapanim, which were the showbreads that were placed on 12 pans, six one above top of the other. On one side, 6 one on top of the other. On the other side, every Friday, they were placed into the inner sanctuary in the temple, described a great deal in the book of Leviticus. And then they miraculously remained fresh from one Friday till the next Friday. And the roster of Kohanim, of priests that served in the temple that week, would then partake of that bread. Miraculously, there was always enough. They were never short. It then speaks about blasphemy and that could bring about execution. Again, we've discussed this before, although the Torah on numerous occasions says that there are crimes for which the result, the punishment is execution. We are taught that a Jewish court of law that executed somebody once in 70 years was considered a bloodthirsty court. It just didn't happen. At a time when these laws were in place, they were deterrents rather than responses. Very big difference. We never wanted to execute. We wanted a person to be aware of the seriousness, the gravity of a sin, so that they didn't come to sin in the first place. Then speaks about the penalty and compensation for murder, injury, destruction of property. So a whole lot of jurisprudence, laws that relate to restoring loss when one has caused damage to somebody else. Those are basically the details that relate to this Shabbat's reading. And now we're going to try and take some of the inspirations, the thoughts that can be derived from a number of the passages that we're going to read about. One of the things that I want to talk about is education. We live in a society in which education is so vitally important. Not only education to be able to have the information and to be able to have the knowledge, which is so much a part of education, but much more so the moral education, the spiritual education, the commitment to values, which so often takes second place. Recently, over Pesach, I spoke very strongly in Shul about the fact that post-COVID, everyone is bemoaning all of the consequences of COVID, and there were many. And students and children suffered a great deal, being isolated, being unable to partake in sport and in social interaction, being alone, being in their homes for so many hours. They lost out on 2 years in so many different ways. Everyone agrees that there's been pain, suffering, and loss. Loss of family members, loss of life, so many areas that we've been affected by. As we're emerging and we're opening up schools, and hopefully one of these days we won't have to worry about masks at all and all the other requirements to preserve our health during these difficult times, there's a tendency amongst parents to immediately say, how can I make the load lighter for my child who's been through so many challenges and difficulties? And unfortunately, the first place that parents look to lighten the load, to lessen the pressure on their child, is in the area of their spiritual development. And so there is a trend that one can actually see across the Jewish community, that the students who are in schools that have many hours a week for Jewish studies, parents are considering moving their children from a school where they might have 20 hours of Jewish studies to schools that have only 10. And those in the schools having 10 hours of Jewish studies are moving to schools that have 1 hour of Jewish studies a week. And students in those schools that only have an hour a week are looking to put their students, their children, into non-Jewish schools where they don't have even that 1 hour. And the general feeling is that we have to lighten the load because our kids have been under pressure. What gives? What's the first area that we sacrifice and we compromise? the area of their spiritual, religious development, the area that that child probably needs more than ever at times of difficulty. It relates to emunah, to faith. It relates to the strength that they have to endure the challenges that they are confronting. They need a moral core and a religious base and the inspiration of Torah in order to confront the realities of their life. The last thing we should even be thinking of at such a time is to lessen the load of their Jewish studies. That's what we should be increasing at such a time. And the thought that the child has to get more subjects in secular and more extra lessons and more pressure in all of the requirements of their secular studies, to the detriment and to the sacrifice of their inspiration, religious inspiration, which they could be getting and should be getting, is shortchanging our children. And we as adults have a responsibility to think about the education of our children. I told a story in Shul about a very sad story many, many years ago. I'm talking about more than 20 years ago. Somebody lost a parent, and the father was very involved at the old great synagogue, which is where I started with our shul, at our community, in Jabert Park. And the son, who'd lost his father, called me to say that he does not know what to do with the books of his father. And I imagined that there was a large library, and the son didn't have place in his home for the library. But when he arrived at my house, he was carrying one book. I can cry when I think about it. It was one book, a marsa that was used, a prayer book that was used for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, leather bound, and obviously well used, but in still beautiful condition. The father's marsa. The son did not know where to put it. And whilst I accepted it, and it's still in my house today, thinking that maybe one day I can repatriate it to the family. But the thoughts that were going through my mind is that in this house, in this home, there are shelves. And on the shelves, there is room for almost anything and everything. Souvenirs, things that come from far off places, things that, trophies from sports, golf, soccer, every kind of unimportant, inconsequential piece of reminder of trips overseas or even art, there's place. One thing there's no place for is a marza, a prayer book used by a father for many years on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. That should have been the core of the home. That should have been put into the very center of the home so that the home could know this is what was important to our father, to our grandfather. So that is a general theme that I want to talk about, is that education has to be seen for being able to impart values, and the most important, the quintessential ingredients of giving our children a happy life. And that is to have values and to aspire to the values of the Torah. The other things might be important as well, but they come nowhere close to giving our children those anchors in life. And why it relates to this week is because when we are told these laws of the Kohanim, it says, Emor la Kohanim, the name of this week's portion is Emor, which means to speak. Speak to the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, and say to them. The obvious question of this verse in Leviticus and Vayikra is, why does it say speak to the Kohanim and say to them? Why would it say twice in the same verse, speak and say? So Rashi, quoting from the Talmud, says the message is to say and say again. Instruct the elders regarding the youngster. Tell the elders to tell the children. Emor v'amarta means speak and say it again. Give the generations the ability to communicate the values from one generation to another. Speak in such a way that it will continue to be said. Inspire our children. So the elders have to be inspired to inspire the children. And if the elders don't, the adults, the parents, don't think it is important, then no matter what they say to the children about that subject, it's not going to be seen as important. So let the elders speak so that they can in turn say it over to their children. Enjoin the elders, speak to the elders so that they will continue to tell it to their children. Now, what's interesting is that this concept of Emor v'amarta, this structure of a verse, speak and say, is only evident in the Torah in 3 specific places. It only uses this structure of language relating to 3 instructions, no others, only these 3. And what are they? The above dictum, which constitutes a primary biblical source for the concept of education, telling the elders, the older people, to tell the children, also offers insight into the nature of the education. So first, let's go into the nature of education. The word lahazhir, which is used to enjoin, the word that is used in the Hebrew, lahazhir gedolim, to tell the elders, to tell the children, the word lahazhir actually means, from the Hebrew word zohar, which means to shine, which means that the process of education has to be illumination. Illuminate the elders regarding the youngsters. Education is not only an elder teaching a youngster, it also means an illumination for the educator, which means that we cannot just say what's important. Our children know what's important to us. They know when our face lights up with delight, when we are feeling fulfilled, when we're excited. But if we're not excited about anything that relates to our spiritual life, and the only thing we're excited about, for example, is our business acumen and our accomplishment in wealth and our sports and all of our social activities and fun, if that's what our life is made of, and then we superimpose onto that and say to the child, you should go to shul. You should also do something. Take a few moments and do something Jewish. The child knows what we shine about. They know what we're excited about. They know what makes us tick. What is the definition of how we live our lives? The children know exactly what makes us tick. And it's only when we are illuminating our own lives with a passion for the values that we're trying to exude and to communicate that there's half a chance that the children will take our instruction seriously. So the first thing is, don't just talk. Shine your values. Let your values be taught by the way your life is invigorated and inspired, and the passion that you have for the values that you're trying to impart. Furthermore, we said that only 3 times in the Torah is this expression used. It's interesting because whenever we use a particular structure, and we're now saying that it means education, meaningful education, communicating our child, not giving up on what our child is going to be. So where would this dictum, the statement about education, be found? And interestingly, it relates to the following 3 things in the Torah. The instruction that we're not allowed to eat blood of an animal. So even though we're eating meat, we extract all the blood out of that meat prior to being able to use kosher meat. Not only does the meat have to come from a kosher animal, but it has to be kashered, which is to extract the blood from the meat, which is done by soaking it in water and salt, thick, coarse salt, to extract the blood. When we're told not to drink or eat blood, it says, Emor v'amarta, the same word, speak and say. A second place is when it tells us not to eat insects. Now, there are a number of creepy crawlies, both flying varieties and creepy crawly varieties, that we're not allowed to eat. We're not allowed to eat chochos, as they say in South Africa. When it tells us not to eat chochos, not to eat insect, it uses this language. Speak and say. Illuminate your lives to such a degree that your children are impacted by the education. And finally, or not finally, the other example is in this week's portion, the verse that we're referring to. In this very verse, when it tells us the laws of priesthood, so it says, this is how you are holy. Emor v'amarta, speak to the kohanim, to the priests, and tell them. The principles of education, the shining of our values, has to affect what? These 3 things in Torah. Disconnected, disjointed details of Torah responsibility. And the question is why? Why these 3 specific areas in the entire Torah is there such an emphasis on education? And what could we derive from this that relates to our own children, our own students, our own environment, the world today? So the Rebbe explains that each of these realms had a reason for a person to believe that trying to educate our children would be against the wind, would be impossible to be achieved. For example, so whilst we might not have any inclination to drink blood, in times of old, blood was a liquid that was drunk by people. People drank it. In order to invigorate their bodies, they believed that it would give vitality to them. Drinking blood was a rage of the day. It was a habit and a drug. People were hooked on blood. That is what they thought gave them the energy. Like we have energy drinks today, they believe that blood was. So blood was so widespread that people were addicted to blood. So in that context, the Torah is saying, a parent, a teacher, an adult is going to say, what is the purpose of talking to a generation that is habituated, that has so trained themselves, so ingrained in their lifestyle, is the way they are practicing the things they're doing? There's no hope to affect their lives in a different way. They are stuck, they are captured by the desire and the need to fulfill their addiction. So how can you possibly think that you're going to impact on somebody's life when they are addicted to what it is that you're telling them is no good? And the Torah is saying, Emor v'amarta. Don't ever look at a child or any other human being and say, I'm writing you off because you are too stuck. There is no way out. There is a way out. There's always a way out. And if one takes the time and effort and builds the relationship and connects and does everything we can extricate somebody from even those dungeons, those very difficult situations where they seem to be imprisoned. It's vitally important that we believe that we can impact. The second area is not to eat insects. So the Talmud tells us that somebody who eats insects is somebody that has no pride, self-pride, a person who has lost the last dignity of human beings. To eat chochos, to eat insects, means that somebody has lost any self-respect whatsoever. So we're not talking about addiction, we're talking about somebody who believes that they can do any kind of activity and not aspire to something which is what a human being should aspire to. So again, we look at a generation, we look at children, we look at our students, and we say, look at their behavior, even if they're not addicted. Look what they consider to be acceptable practices. They are like chocho eaters. They like eating insects. They are people that are so out of the possibility of engaging with them with meaning, write them off. And the Torah says, Emor v'amarta, educate even in these areas, certainly for any other things, but the things that you believe are impossible to be able to impact through education, put yourself with extra effort and extra energy in the areas which you don't believe possible, because it is possible. Don't look at somebody and write them off and say they are below being able to be impacted with holiness, because we all have a soul and we all have a part of God. And even if we've lost the way and we're behaving in a totally decrepit, negative, inappropriate way, if we could touch soul, we could build that person once again. Don't give up on anybody. The third area, which is really our area, the subject of this Shabbat, is about talking about holiness. Here we're talking about telling people about a domain, a room, a place that is considered holy. You cannot enter into it unless you're prepared with holiness. To the visible eye, there is nothing that we can see that discerns between what is holy and not holy. God determined that this is holy and Jerusalem is more holy, and in Jerusalem the temple is more holy, and in the holies of holies within the temple, that's the highest state of holiness. A person with a physical, practical mind says, why? Why would you differentiate between Jerusalem and any other city? It just looks like another city. It's an ancient city. Their houses, their homes, their roofs, their pathways. It doesn't make it anything more important than another. What is the ingredient that makes it significant? What makes this food or this time or the Sabbath holy? Not anything that you can discern with your own eyes. The physical world has no part of a world of holiness. So again, the parent, the teacher, the adult could say, how can we talk about things that the world around us doesn't embrace, doesn't see as valuable, thinks is ridiculous, thinks is archaic, old-fashioned, and irrelevant? Comes the Torah and says, yeah, you believe that you cannot aim for higher, that you cannot talk about values that are beyond? And Moiva Amarta, shine as adults. Set the example. Be passionate about your message. Create the relationships and the care and the love and the concern for the student that you're teaching. And your child can begin to appreciate something that they never appreciated before. Who knows how close that individual might be to wanting to rebuild their lives if only they shown the direction. And there are many examples, like in the 60s, at the time when there was a revolution and there was Woodstock and young children, teenagers were rebelling against every formal structure of society and saying that this is not something that they think is important. And therefore they broke down all the structures and all the supposedly important things of society. And they let their hair grow long and they looked like they didn't care, they didn't wash and didn't bathe, and they were hippies. And so many people in society said, these people are beyond the pale. They're beyond being able to affect with education and with upliftment, because they've given up on all the values that a sane, rational society embraces. What did the Rebbe say? The Rebbe said that these individuals are thirsting for meaning. They're looking to find meaning in life. If they are just given a bit of warmth and shown direction, they will embrace the spiritual dimension. And true, just after the 60s, a revolution took place where so many people came back to the values of the Torah, to the importance of Shabbat and keeping kosher. There was a trend, that a movement that was founded across the world where people started coming home. So this is about how we look at people around us. When we want to educate, we could have a million reasons why it's impossible. These are the reasons why today we cannot educate the next generation. They have addictions. You can't get them away from their PlayStations and from their computers and the computer games. It's impossible to tear them away, because that's where their mind is at. They're living in their social media interactions. They're addicted to it and spending 10, 15 hours, and it's impossible to get their attention. We've got to stop saying these are the problems. We've got to start saying these are the solutions. And Moira Marta, talk to the child that looks so addicted. And you never know, this child might be wanting to let go of the crutch that they're holding on to, because they're inadequate, they don't know how to speak to friends, they don't know how to enter in the social circle. They're happier just to go into their inner dark room and to play Fortnite. But with a little bit of inspiration, with a little bit of care, we are able to teach even the child that is habitually involved with things that are so distant, so far away. Even the child who eats insects, representing a society in which we've allowed and accepted and embraced every madness and every craziness, and every immoral, inappropriate behavior has become justified and acceptable. Don't give up. Don't look at a child or the next individual and say, you behaved so badly, you're not worthy of Torah. Torah is for everybody. Find the method. Emor v'amarta. Illuminate your life to such an extent that you become relevant, connected, and therefore impacting, and you will succeed. And the third thing is, the one from our portion, aim high. Don't limit people to what you think is the average and the norm that will be acceptable to society. There was a story told about a rabbi who was giving his shir and talking, and somebody came over to him and said, "Rabbi, you're talking way above their heads." And he said, I know I'm talking above their heads. I'm talking to where the heads should be. Maybe sometimes that's what we need to do. Like in the game of rugby, the goals are not under the bar, but over the bar. Sometimes we've got to aspire to higher, and we've got to think about how we can aim for something much, much higher. So teach about kahuna, teach about holiness, teach about sanctity, teach about the intangibles, the holiness and the spiritual elements of life that we can't touch and we can't see, and that are beyond what's supposedly the domain of the people that we're trying to impact on. And you never know. Omer v'amarta, speak and say. Illuminate your life with a passion. Connect yourself with real relationships. Make yourself relevant, and you don't know to what effect, to the ripple effect that you're going to have on society, on the people, and them on the people around them. The saying will continue to be said. The illumination will continue to ignite other illumination. Spent a lot of time on this point, but I think it is such a valuable point in terms of how we view the responsibility and the abilities of education. The one thing we spoke about, very technical, is that a Kohen is not allowed to contaminate himself. Everyone knows, sorry, I was just reminded that there's that there's load shedding at 8 o'clock, which is in 6 minutes. So in 6 minutes, I turn into a cookie monster and you won't see me. So it's going to be pretty abrupt. So let's see how we can use the next 6 minutes to be lahazir, to illuminate, to shine before the darkness settles in. So it says that a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, is not allowed to contaminate himself, meaning to come into contact with the dead, even for his own immediate family, for his wife, for his children, for his parents, for his siblings. What's the only one situation that the high priest is allowed to come into contact with the dead? It's called a meit mitzvah. A person is walking along the road and there's a dead person. Nobody knows how he got there, nobody knows how he died, but there's nobody to bury them. Suddenly, the person who's not even allowed to come into contact with the dead, that he's his own parent, has a responsibility to somebody to bring a person to an appropriate burial, to a dignified burial, which is what every person, we're taken from the earth, we return to the earth. Suddenly, the responsibility to society supersedes all the other responsibilities. And the high priest has to roll up his sleeves and bury. Just shows you how much we have to care for one another. A dead person who has nobody else to look after them, so then one cannot walk away and say, well, I can't because I have laws that guide me as an individual. If there's nobody else to do it, then the Kohen, the high priest, has to do it. Responsibility, accountability, commitment to the needs of others. I want to share a quick thought about the cycles of the festivals, both in the spiritual domain and in the natural order. And that is that the main festivals of the Jewish year are Pesach, which is the Exodus, Shavuot, when we receive the Torah, and the festival of Sukkot, which is post Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, when we commemorate Hashem's protection of us, the shelter of Hashem. And when they are described in the Torah, although they have so many spiritual, religious connotations, they are also described in very physical terms. They are festivals of the farmer. So therefore, the festival of Pesach is described as the Chag, the festival that relates to the spring. That's the season. The seasons of these Jewish festivals fall into particular places in the cycle of the sun, in the cycle of the seasons of the year. And Pesach is always in the spring. Shavuot, which is the time that we remember the giving of the Torah, is called the harvest festival. And the festival of Sukkot, which comes at the end of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is related to the ingathering, because after a person harvested his wheat, he left it in the field to dry over the winter months. And at the end of the winter, when it was now starting to be the rain season, just prior to that, they would take all of their wheat and bring it into their storehouses. What's the correlation between the farmers' festivals and the religious festivals? And there's such a beautiful correlation which is presented by the Maharal, that the season of spring, which means the opportunity, the brand new beginning of a new, brighter world coming out of the dark, cold winter, spring. So that's both physical, but also spiritually. That's when we were redeemed. That's when we came out of Egypt, the darkness of winter, the winter of our lives as a people. We emerged as an opportunity, a brand new opportunity of the spring. And then we went to stand at Sinai, which means that we harvested our freedom. Our freedom wasn't just escape from incarceration. There was purpose, there was meaning. The field produced, and we harvested the wealth of the field. That's what happened when we stood spiritually at Sinai. That's what happens in the physical condition of the farm. And when we gather in all of the wealth into our homes, that comes at the end of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, a whole process of cleansing, of self-evaluation, of perfecting our lives, and then we gather in the wealth, the spiritual wealth into our homes. There is a correlation, and the important point that the Maharal is saying is that we should not live disjointed lives, our world of spiritual pursuit and our world of physical involvement. There is a correlation. They parallel one another. The physical can be used for the spiritual, and the spiritual can infuse the physical with meaning. There needs to be a harmony and a productiveness that works between the world of the spiritual and the world of the physical. And there's another couple of other details. We also speak about the counting of the omer this week, which is what we're doing every night. Tonight, for example, happens to be the 26th night of the omer, 26 nights since the festival of Pesach, on our journey towards the receiving of the Torah, which is on the 49th, the 50th day. And our counting, the word sephira also means a sapphire. It means to be a gem, a radiant force of light. These days we are illuminating, we are perfecting ourselves day by day as we move from the Exodus to the season of the receiving of the Torah. The lights are about to go out, so I think that I need to say goodnight and thank everyone for joining. We've spent a disproportionate amount of time on education, but I think that it relates to all of us. We all have messages that we want to give to the world around us, not even if we're not teachers and even if we're not parents. We impact on people around us, and we should have the eyes that look at people around us with the eyes that see their potential strength, and how we can impact on them meaningfully. Have a beautiful, beautiful Shabbos, a beautiful week. I'm just going to close down stopping the sharing. I will post all of this on a YouTube so that everyone's able to listen to it at whatever time at their leisure. Thank you all for joining. Have a beautiful, beautiful week.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Thank you.
Beautiful, Rabbi.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Beulah. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chava, thank you for joining. Thank you, Evie.
I love it.
Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you. Good night.
Enjoy the dark.